Good afternoon, and welcome to our mid-Passover, mid-Ramadan, and post-Easter Jewish Policy Center webinar. I am Bryen, Senior Director of the JPC and your host. I hope you all had an excellent holiday, regardless of which it was, and had a pleasant and peaceful week in any event. I know that many of you are here today because you have seen and heard our guest, Dr. Stephen Bryen, possibly in our Insight series, possibly in Focus. He is, I have to say, a weapons wonk. He's been with us before to talk about Israel's aerial defense capabilities, the short war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and earlier about Ukraine. But before we go to him for our Ukraine update, your JPC commercial. The Jewish Policy Center was founded in 1985 as a 501c3 organization, providing analysis of foreign and domestic policies. That's policies, not politics. Our website is jewishpolicycenter.org. There you can read our Insight articles, In Focus Quarterly, our blog In Context, or you can read Alliance Tracker and Frontline Defense. There's a lot of good information. I really encourage you to go to the website. We at the JPC support a strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security relations, and missile defense. We support the legitimacy and security of Israel against anyone who would deny them. As an organization that sits slightly to the right of center, the JPC advocates for small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, energy security, and free speech and intellectual diversity. In this series of calls, which I have to say, I'm shocked. We've been here more than 2 years and you guys are still tuning in, so this is great for us. But in this series of calls, we have been pleased to bring you scholars and policymakers on issues including China in various permutations, Israel issues, including but not only the Abraham Accords and the Hamas-Fatah civil war. There will be more on that in the future. Iranian nuclear aspirations, the kind of rolling rebellion that's still occurring around Iran in various places. We've taken side trips to the US Supreme Court and home schooling. Today we're on Ukraine, but Ukraine is also a conversation about Russia, the battlefield, and the political situation. And I'm going to squeeze in a question about pipelines, energy, and security. Our guest, as you know, is Dr. Stephen Bryen, Senior Fellow at the Center for Security Policy. He was the founder and first director of the Defense Technology Security Agency during the Reagan administration, where he was also Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Trade Security Policy. Prior to that, he was staff director of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was executive director of a grassroots political organization and the director of CHINSA. Post-government, Steve was president of FinMechanica North America and a commissioner on the U.S.-China Security Review Commission. He's written for a great many publications, including Asia Times, Washington Times, Newsweek, American Thinker, Epoch Times, and here for the JPC, which is my excuse to say again, please visit our website, jewishpolicycenter.org. He has published 6 books on technology and security, including Technology, Security, and National Power, and Security for Holy Places. And he has contributed to a number of studies on national security and defense. Last thing, your public service announcement. You are muted. That's it. That's your public service announcement. But you can send questions during the presentation using the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. I am monitoring it. The questions will come out. And with that, Stephen Bryen, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. It's nice to be with you today. I think what I'd like to do is to put up some slides to walk us through what's going on in Ukraine. But I want to make a caveat first. All the information we have is highly unreliable, whether it's coming from the Ukrainian side, a little bit from the Russian side, or from the general Western press, which basically speculates on a lot about which it knows very little. So with that kind of caveat, we still can get a picture of what's going on. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen, I hope. There we go. I hope you can see that. And this is what I call a preliminary assessment. So let me just get started right away in, if I can. Here we go. First, a word about the current situation. As you probably have read or know about, Russia has redeployed its forces to the eastern part of Ukraine, and it's in the process of reinforcing those forces. Probably right now, it has on the order of 70 to 80,000 troops engaged there, and it will probably grow to well over 90,000, maybe over 100,000. The Russians have pulled completely out of the Kiev area, which they had surrounded for a period, and moved all those forces over or retired them back to Russia. Their losses are very heavy. Around 15,000 killed, some say 20,000. The numbers are hard to come by, and they're very difficult to verify. On the Ukrainian side, around 5,000 killed. It could be higher. The Ukrainians keep saying it's less, but there you have it. Civilian deaths, as estimated by the United Nations, which is not necessarily a completely reliable source, but the only one we have on this, is around 4,200 people, probably closer to 10,000 when it's all over. Around 3.5 million Ukrainians have left the country. So it's a big desertion rate, if you want to call it that. Many of them are women and children, but not and elderly people, and they largely have gone to Poland, to other Eastern European countries, and then some of them are flown outside to even to the United States. Now, Russia has lost a lot of equipment, and the level of losses is really, again, hard to estimate. There's a look, sorry, went too far. There's an outfit called Oryx, which actually takes pictures of every piece of destroyed equipment and then counts them up. And these numbers are up to date, and they're saying 316 Russian tanks, which is a lot of tanks to lose. Most of them destroyed, some of them abandoned, some of them captured. According to NATO, roughly 25% of the original invading force into Ukraine, the Russian invading force, have been taken out of action, either through death or wounding or through other circumstances. But they've also been replaced. So we have a picture where Russian forces have taken a lot of losses, and a lot of those losses have also been at the level of high officers, generals, senior colonels have been killed in action. Some of them were targeted by Ukrainian ambushes and were killed that way. Others were just killed in the course of battle. But it also shows that the Russian officers are in the front lines and are leading the fight. Now, the Ukrainians have also lost a lot of equipment, 103 tanks at least, which is a large number for Ukraine, which had about 400 tanks in the beginning of the war. So basically, if this number is right, they've lost about 25% of their heavy armor. And they've lost almost all their aircraft. Today, Ukraine really doesn't have an air force. And yesterday, one of the remaining MiG-29s, which was the best fighter that the Ukrainians had, was shot down by the Russians. They've lost almost all their helicopters. This number here, which says 3, you can disregard. Almost all the helicopters have been destroyed. What's not shown here, which I think is significant, and it's being reported now, is that much of the air defenses, not the little man pads, the man-held devices, but the serious heavy anti-aircraft, anti-missile systems have been mostly destroyed by the Russians. The last ones were SA-8s, which were in the Donbass area, and most of those have been knocked out. For the Ukrainians, have lost a number of naval ships. By the way, the Russians have lost considerably more in terms of the importance of the ships, but they've lost 15 of their ships. Most of these are smaller craft. We would call them patrol boats, but they were destroyed by the Russians pretty early on in the war. Now I want to put a map up. I hope you can see it. This map shows an overall picture of Ukraine. You can see Belarus at the top, which is over here. You can see this is all Russian territory here. And this area here from Kharkiv all the way down to Mykolaiv and close to Odessa. All this area is what's regarded as the Donetsk area or Donbass Basin. It is where the major fighting is going on now. I want to give you a closer view, and I think this map is useful because this is where the war is. And these are the cities of Crimea, which you can see here roughly in the middle to the right a little bit. And I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but Crimea was taken by the Russians yesterday. There were serious heavy battles around Izium and some around Donetsk itself, which has been going on for years, actually. Mariupol down here, which is on the Sea of Azov, is a very important city because it was held by the Ukrainians. They've lost Kherson and Melitopol, but Mariupol was a major city and a major port. That city has almost entirely been taken by the Russians, with the exception of one steel mill. I'll come to that in just a minute. So it's a major defeat for Ukraine to lose that city, and it's part of what the Russians are trying to achieve, which is a large corridor that will take it all the way to Crimea, which it controls. And this is part of the objective of the invasion, which is to control the eastern Ukraine and to have a corridor to Crimea, which will change the whole situation as far as Ukraine is concerned. Now, this is the Azovstal steel mills in the background in this picture that you're seeing. And this is where the last fighting in Mariupol is taking place. There are probably 1,000 fighters, maybe less. No one knows exactly. Underneath this steel mill, under this steel mill are a number of caves and passageways, which is where these guys are holding out. There are also reportedly civilians there. Nobody knows how many. The Russians keep asking them to surrender, and they say no, they don't want to surrender. But on the other hand, attempts to relieve them by Ukraine have failed. So the likelihood is this will end up in very nasty fighting in the next few days. But so far as Mariupol itself is concerned, it's liberated by the Russians. There's very little chance of any recapture by the Ukrainians. So let's take a look at the Russian army performance and how it's gone. It was a very proud army. It's got a lot of problems, as everybody now knows. What are those problems? Some of it's technology. They have lacked secure tactical communications, which is a big surprise. So they have relied very heavily on open radios and on cellular phones to communicate, which means the Ukrainians have been able to track them, identify their officers, and launch operations based on these unsecured communications. A big no-no, something the Russians should never have allowed to happen. Russian IFF, these are friend or foe systems that were supposed to function, really don't function, which is a problem. The main tanks that have been destroyed, there have been three categories of tanks used by the Russians: a few T-90s, a fair number of T-80s, and mainly T-73s, different models. Most of the tanks destroyed have been T-73s. And there have been major flaws in the design of the armor of those tanks. In particular, when they're hit, the ammunition tends to explode, cooked off, as sometimes the military calls it, killing the crew and destroying the tank. And one of the obvious evidences of that kind of thing is where you see the turret lying on the roadside blown off from the tank. That's what happens when a tank is hit and sustains a fatal injury. Russian aircraft, for the most part, lack targeting pods. They never had them, which means that their bombing runs tend to be gross and not precise, which means a lot of civilians get killed, even if that's not the Russian intention. Whether it is or not the Russian intention is open to some debate. The aircraft countermeasures that are used by the Russians are also quite old. I mean, 20, 30 years back, mainly flares to decoy infrared weapons and chaff, which is the little pieces of aluminum foil and thrown out of the airplanes to confuse radars. They do not have DIRCM systems, which are directed infrared countermeasure systems that are now part of the US arsenal and have been for maybe 15 years. These are not found on Russian aircraft. Russian tank protection is quite out of date. They do have on them reactive armor, which came into vogue in the 70s, which is 50 years ago, if you think about it. But they don't have active protection systems like the Israeli trophy. In fact, the Russians had a copy of, I would call it a copy, or their own copy of an active protection system called the Arena M. One would have thought that would have been on the tanks used in this fight, but they're not found. I mean, all the pictures I've seen show the tanks without that system on them. It's visible, so you can see it. It's quite visible, which says one of a number of things. Either it doesn't work, it's a bad system, so the Russians didn't put it on their tanks, or they didn't have the money to put it on their tanks, which I think is possible. Or they just held them back, which I think is unlikely. I think the bottom line is that they just don't have most of their tanks adapted to the Arena M system. The other thing to note is that there's been no effective protection against UAV strikes. The Turkish Bayraktar drone has been effective, but there are very few of those. So, and they're getting shot down. So at some point or another, whether the lack of this protection against these strikes is less and less important. And the Russian systems are not integrated. So the aircraft don't talk to the ground forces, so on. And the different ground force units aren't well coordinated. And there are problems like that, which something the Russians should have solved a while ago if they had any smarts at all, which they appear not to have. This is the Russian ship Moskva. I have to use the past tense here. It was a very powerful ship. It was the flagship of the Black Sea for the Russians. It was destroyed allegedly by two missiles fired by the Ukrainians. This is the ship after it was hit. It's a peculiar photo. In the center of the ship, in this part, is where the missile defenses are that would have been launched by the Russians. And you can see that the hatches are closed, meaning that nothing was launched. So either the ship was caught entirely by surprise, which is a possibility, and didn't respond to the missile strikes, or it responded but failed, which seems pretty odd, or something else killed the ship. Now, the Russians say it was killed by a fire in the ammunition storage area and not by an Ukrainian attack. There was at least one US P-8 naval reconnaissance aircraft operating in the Black Sea over this area where the ship was. It does carry torpedoes and it carries anti-ship harpoon missiles. Whether any of those were used and whether the US was involved, I have no idea, but it's speculation at this point. In any case, the ship was wounded. It was going back to Sevastopol under its own power, but listing badly. The seas were rough and it sank. So it is no longer a ship of the Russian fleet, but it was a pretty modern ship, although it was built in 1983. This is the Neptune missile that the Ukrainians claim. This is the sensor end of the missile called the Neptune that the Ukrainians claim they used. And you can see the radar, that yellow thing and the brownish yellow thing is the radar dish, which guides this missile at the last part of its flight. The last part of its flight is pretty low to the surface. So it could have hit the Moskva, but we don't know. Now, in terms of the battle, the British say, and the Pentagon is saying the same thing, that this could be a very long fight that's going on now in eastern Ukraine. The Russians have already started very heavy artillery barrages, and they're also using their bombers with standoff weapons fired from inside Russian territory, I might add, not over Ukrainian territory, softening up the Ukrainian positions. And the Russians say they hit 1,260 Ukrainian military assets yesterday. So it's a lot. And it's going to be a long battle. The difference between what's happening in eastern Ukraine and what happened in the north around Kiev and those areas is that this is tank country. Much of this area is flatlands or rolling lands, farmlands, which are ideal for tanks and makes it more difficult for the Ukrainians to use the hit and run ambush tactics that they used fairly successfully. Well, I would say more than fairly successfully, very successfully in the north. So the advantage essentially of the weight of armor and the use of artillery and the use of standoff weapons, that goes very much in favor of the Russians in this last phase of the battle. Now, there have been negotiations going on continuously between Russia and Ukraine, mainly at the working level. About 2 weeks ago, the Ukrainians backed off of what they had agreed to preliminarily and essentially scuttled the negotiations for now, thinking that with Washington's support and new equipment rolling in, that they could beat the Russians. Now, you'll notice in the background, there's one face where I drew a red circle. That man is this man, Denis Kirev, or Denis Kirev. He was one of the peace negotiators, and it seems that the Ukrainians believed he was a spy and he was executed, just to show you. Now, while the Ukrainians also, by the way, before I go further on this, while the Ukrainians are also conducting their own purge, and a number of Ukrainian generals have been dismissed and have been called traitors by Zelensky. Whether they're under arrest or what their situation is, we just don't know. Previously, Zelensky had arrested all the opposition politicians, either putting them in house arrest or putting them in jail. So he's, whether that's justified or not, you decide. Meanwhile, Putin is also carrying out a purge because he didn't like the way things went in Ukraine, and he had reason not to like it. About 150 security officials have been used to start the new offensive, have been purged by Putin as the new offensive started. What that means, we don't know. Who they all are, we don't know, but many of them are FSB, and as you probably know, the FSB is the successor to the KGB. So for those who think that the security forces are not with the operating military forces, think again. It's classic Russian doctrine to have the regular commanders and the political operatives. And this man in uniform on the left that you see in the image, it says FSB Alpha Group was part of the invading force. So many of these guys have been arrested. Some are being accused of being traitors. This man, whose name is Sergei Beseda, was one of the highest level officials. He had been put under arrest about 2 weeks ago by Putin and then moved to prison. So he's obviously going to face very severe charges. This man, Viktor Surkov, has been accused of embezzling $5 billion worth of funds that were used to run the undercover operations in Ukraine against the Ukrainians. He's now under house arrest. And the Russians have changed their commander. The new commander is a fellow named Alexander Dvornikov. He was the same guy who carried out Russian operations in Syria. And his claim to fame, of course, was flattening the city of Aleppo, which was a pretty brutal operation. But that's what you're going to see from this fellow. You're going to see very tough, very unrelenting blitzkrieg kind of operation by the Russian forces. And if he can sustain that, I don't think that the Ukrainians can survive the process. So what are the outcomes? Where are we going? Right now, Zelensky and his most recently a deputy of his have said they're not interested in negotiations, while the Russians have filed new papers with the Ukrainians proposing some ideas on how to resolve the conflict. I have no idea what's in it because they were filed today. But the Russians, I think, prefer a negotiated solution. The Ukrainians do not at the moment, but they may change their tune very quickly as the battle unfolds in eastern Ukraine. Among the points and the most important ones from the Russian point of view is something the Ukrainians have more or less already conceded, that there'll be no NATO membership and there'll be no NATO bases in Ukraine. The Russians also want no nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Then we get to the Donetsk and Luhansk problems, which are the two eastern provinces in Ukraine that are where the battles are now. And originally these were covered under the Minsk II Accords, and I can go into that later if there's any questions about it. The Russians previously said they would be willing to follow Minsk II, which would have put eastern Ukraine under an autonomous control of the Ukrainian authorities, but still autonomous operationally. I don't think the Russians will take that now, so I can't tell you where we're actually going. But I think I'll wind up the dog and pony show at this point and open up to questions if I can.
You can. Yes, you can. And I'm going to use the prerogative of the chair to ask the first question. You, as a government employee, have been talking about Europe's choice to rely on Russian energy since the 1980s, including preventing the first Yamal pipeline with US sanctions in 1983. Apparently now they're starting, finally, to think about disengaging. My questions are they really? Can they? And where else will they go for energy?
Well, I've talked to my friends who are oil experts, and there isn't any energy around at the moment that's going to take care of their problem. So, I mean, if it's going to take a number of years to shift the balance of resources from Russia to other possibilities. Having said that, even the Germans, while they talk a good line, still haven't reopened their nuclear plants, which they've shut down. I mean, so are they serious? When the Russian gas is still flowing, prices are higher, of course, because energy prices are higher, but it's still going to be a lot cheaper than LNG shipped in from the United States, if we could ship enough in, which we cannot. So I tend to believe that things will normalize, and it'll be a long time coming before the Europeans wean themselves off of Russian gas. They really got hooked on it.
Yeah, I'm going to put two together here from listeners. This conflict has been brewing for years. Does the US carry any responsibility for not avoiding the war? And secondarily, why did NATO string along Ukraine when they knew they wouldn't admit them? Why weren't the Minsk Accords followed?
Those are good questions. In regard to the first, I think that Washington has a lot of responsibility for this war, and it could have been avoided. And part of that was by encouraging Zelensky and the Ukrainians to resist making a deal with the Russians. The Russians kept saying for the longest time, 7 or 8 years, the Minsk II agreements offered a framework for a solution the Russians were willing to sign up to it. They asked the Ukrainians to do it. The Ukrainians did not do it, largely at the encouragement not only of Washington, but of NATO itself. Kept telling the Ukrainians, don't agree to that. You don't have to back away, make a deal. We'll support you. Now, as far as the question of NATO leading the Ukraine around by the nose, so to speak, and offering them membership that they weren't willing to give. Ukraine was part of a NATO partnership for a number of years. US troops and Germans and British and others were involved in Ukraine for years, and many years, about 6 or 7 years, training Ukrainian special forces to do exactly what they did, and they did it well. So I think that from the point of view, there was no chance that the Germans were never going to agree to nor were the Hungarians and some others, to having Ukraine a formal member of the NATO alliance. But they were more than willing to have this less than formal membership in the NATO alliance, and to make sure that the Ukrainians got weapons and support and training, intelligence, all that was pouring into Ukraine for years. And that, of course, encouraged the Ukrainians not to negotiate with the Russians because, the Russians thought, and I think they may have been right, the Ukrainians were preparing to carry out an offensive, a new offensive, because there had been 2 previous ones in 2014 and 2015, to carry out an offensive and win Eastern Ukraine back from Russian control, let's call it that, because there were no Russian troops there, or there were Russian supply troops there. And also maybe then to do the same thing in Crimea. So I suspect that's why NATO did what it did, and why the Ukrainians did what they did. And at the end of the day, why the Russians did what they did, because they became completely convinced, whether it was true or not, they were convinced by the intelligence that they were getting that Ukraine was gearing up for a big battle, and they had no choice but to invade. That's their view. There's some credence to it.
So here's a question. What's wrong with the Russian army? You mentioned Russian technology issues. We tend to generally ascribe to our adversaries whatever capabilities they claim to have. Was that a mistake in the case of Russia? And should that encourage us to look at China and reevaluate what we think of what they say?
Well, it does give you pause for thought. I mean, look, the Russian problems are both equipment and also how they manage the whole invasion, which was very poorly managed. And the lack of, they used a lot of conscripts. They weren't well trained. And training is a big issue for the Russians, for sure. We don't know much about China, to be honest, because we have never seen them. The last time we saw them in a war of any significance was in Vietnam, where they didn't do so well against Vietnamese, and where we saw them before that in Korea, where they did very well, but at a very high cost. And it was a mass, over the hill kind of threat against US NATO forces. What that means today is hard to say, but I think we overvalue I would say 2 things. First of all, Chinese technology looks very good on paper. But again, it's largely on paper, but it looks very good. It looks better than the Russian stuff. We don't know anything about China's command and control capabilities, how rigid it might be, how flexible they could be on the battlefield. So all that's just blank. We don't know. And so I think Washington has tended to overestimate China's capabilities, because there's a lot of it, because they have a lot of forces and a lot of equipment and a lot of modern equipment. They have a big Navy now, things like that. They have a better and better Air Force. They have a huge missile force. Does that mean they win? No, it doesn't mean they win at all. We have a pretty good force of our own. And one of the differences is the American approach to war, which is quite different from the Eastern approach to war. So we're going to release a study at the end of next week on defending Taiwan. that I think, which is put together with the help of a number of important generals and one admiral, all of whom had senior positions in the Pacific. And then I think we'll tell a different story about China.
We'll invite you back to talk.
That was
when the
advertised.
time. I know you were asking for an invitation to come back. Okay. You also mentioned that Russia is firing on Ukraine from Russian territory. A couple of questions arose from that. First, is it possible or advisable for Ukraine to destroy a strategic military industrial target in Russia, to point out that it goes both ways? Secondarily, can missiles provided by NATO and launched from the western edge of Ukrainian territory into Russia, can they do that without creating the involvement for NATO in the shooting war that President Biden and most of NATO appear to want to avoid?
Good question. I mean, the Russians have been warning NATO now that if you put this heavy equipment in, they're not going to just focus on Ukraine. They're going to focus on the staging areas where the equipment's coming from, which are mainly in Poland. So whether that equipment ever shows up, I don't know. Could the Ukrainians hit a Russian target? They already did last week. Was it a smart thing for them to do? I don't think so. I think it was a dumb thing for them to do, because all that does is means the Russians will use bigger bombs and destroy more Ukrainian territory than maybe the Ukrainians can tolerate. I think the Ukrainians, they need to stabilize the front in the east and then negotiate. That's their best course of action. They don't seem willing to do that, but that's probably the bottom line.
So leads to another question. If Russia keeps the territorial gains that it's made in Ukraine, what's the impact on NATO? And also, if Russia is not prosecuted for war crimes, how does that affect not only NATO, but other states that consider those kinds of actions to be in their interest? The Syrians, including that general, Russian general, never paid for their CW attacks on the Syrian people, not to mention Aleppo.
I'm very dubious of this talk about war crimes. Usually it's the victors who decide if there's going to be war crimes or not the losers. And I think in this case, at the end of the day, NATO is going to be the loser. I mean, this is my speculation. It's just speculation. But I don't see, I mean, there's a real risk the whole Ukrainian state could collapse. So I think that right now, the bulk of what Ukraine has to fight with is in that eastern area, more or less 70,000 soldiers. Whatever armor they have, no air support of any consequence, very limited artillery. So I think that the Ukrainians can hold out only for so long. And as the impact on NATO, well, NATO is going to have to rethink what it's supposed to be doing with itself. I think that the whole business of NATO expansion, which now Finland and Sweden are talking about joining, they may have second thoughts. That's my opinion.
So that led to a historical question. Is it true that Russia after World War II wanted to be part of NATO and they were refused? Is that, did that?
It's true that it is true that I don't know about right after World War II. Mm-hmm. I don't think so, but I know that Putin had raised the idea with the United States and with the Germans and others that maybe Russia could become a kind of corresponding member of NATO. This was in a very optimistic moment, yes. To say the least. Yes. But Russia has, until 2 months ago, had a membership, a kind of membership in NATO. They had a representation there. They had a staff of 15 or 20 people in Brussels, and NATO also had a staff, because people forget that, in Moscow. So the idea was to be as transparent as possible with each other and to try and avoid conflict. One of the dumbest things that NATO did 2 months ago was to kick Russia, before the invasion, was to kick Russia out of NATO, out of this representational NATO. So the Russians then kicked the NATO delegation out of Moscow. But why? I mean, if you really want to live with Russia and you don't have much choice in the matter, I think the last thing you want to do is create that kind of contretemps, because it's hard to find your way back. What's going to happen after the war? This war is going to end. And at some point, a peace deal is going to be made. What's going to happen in Europe? What's NATO going to do? How is Russia going to relate to NATO? Is it going to move all its nuclear weapons up on, along the borders? I mean, we don't really want to see that. It took us years to get the Russians to get rid of the SS-20s and move them back, and get rid of them. So I think that these are danger areas. And one of the things that I think that the Russians had offered, and we disagreed, we didn't do it, was to negotiate the kind of status of Eastern Europe in terms of nuclear weapons, in terms of forced deployments, that kind of thing, which could have been a useful negotiation, but it didn't happen. Will we go back to that? I rather doubt it.
So I'm going to try to fit two questions together. First person asks, so if I understand your conclusion that the primary reason for Russia's invasion was NATO membership for Ukraine, but Germany and others were never going to make that happen, and not the fear of a successful democratic country and Putin's desire for the Russian empire to include Ukraine and Belarus. Is that what he was looking
I
for?
never said any of those things.
Okay, well, I'll send you
I
the
said
question
that-
because it's someone
that-
you know.
I said one of the Russian objectives is clearly not to have NATO in Ukraine. One of them is not to have nuclear weapons in Ukraine. The Russians have also expressed serious concern about M41 launchers, part of the Aegis Ashore system, which the US has put in Poland and Romania, which can also launch Tomahawk cruise missiles, something the Russians are concerned about. But I think their objective was originally to try and force a conclusion in eastern Ukraine, and a settlement, let's call it that, under the Minsk II agreements. And when the Ukrainians looked like they were massing to attack eastern Ukraine, the Russians took the initiative and attacked Ukraine.
But it's
I don't know that it means that they want to take over Ukraine. I don't know why you'd want to.
Well, I'm not going to answer that question, but I would say the Ukrainians had some reason to be concerned because Putin's speech and the speech of certain other Russian officials suggested more than just an interest in eastern Ukraine, but that Ukraine itself is an illegitimate country. And they've gone so far now as to start talking about the end of World War II was an illegitimate end of World War II. Anyway, that Ukraine itself belongs inside of the Russian Empire. So you've got some of this and some of that. But the question comes from a listener. Strategic objectives now. Where is Putin? Is he trying to save the regime from disgrace? Is he trying to solidify Russian control over the natural gas fields and the mines of eastern Ukraine? Is he also trying to intimidate NATO? What's Putin come to, regardless of what he said about the legitimacy of Ukraine as a country?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think back to the legitimacy issue. I mean, the Russians are negotiating with the Ukrainians, so they're recognizing Ukraine. Whether they have greater ambitions is something else. But as far as right now is concerned, it looks like what the Russians want to do is solve the problem of Donbass. And that includes a corridor that's clearly a corridor that takes them all the way to Crimea. And that's what they're going to want. Beyond that, I don't know. Do the Russians have greater ambitions? Some people think so. Putin talked about, the relationship of the Slavic people and the importance of little Ukraine to big Russia and all that stuff. But this is an old theme. There's nothing new in it. Russians have been saying that forever. But I think that so far as the basics of a peace deal are concerned, we could hope to get a deal. We could also get a stalemate that never ends, but that's in nobody's interest. I mean, particularly Ukraine. So Ukraine has a relatively small fighting force and it's getting eaten up. At some point, the whole thing will collapse. That's my greater worry, that if you really want to invite the Russians in, you lose a war of attrition. So at some point, I think Zelensky has to decide and take the risk of making a deal. And that's going to be a tougher deal than he would have gotten 3 months ago or 6 months ago or 6 years ago. These guys have been fighting off. They signed the Minsk II was a protocol that was signed by Ukraine, by Russia, and by the two so-called republics, Luhansk and Donetsk. And it was overseen and guaranteed by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And they all signed it. And it said in there, and one of the provisions, key provision, was that the Donetsk and Luhansk areas would become autonomous, but under Ukrainian law. That was the deal. And the Russians were happy with that. And that's what Putin kept saying, just sign the deal. He refused to even talk about it, refused to even have a discussion of it. So that's the actual real origin of this war. NATO baited it by training the Ukrainian forces, arming them, the US was arranging to put naval and air bases in Ukraine to support US NATO forces. So the Russians knew what they were looking at. I mean, they were getting a very one-sided picture of this war from the Western press, which doesn't tend to read history and understand what was going on. And if you look at it that way, I mean, I'm not justifying the Russian invasion, not at all. But the fact is that it was baiting the Russians. And I don't know why NATO wanted to do that and what the basis of it was and how it could benefit security and stability in Europe. And no one has looked at that issue properly, it seems to me, and challenged these assumptions that were thrown out there by NATO and by Washington, and what basis they had and why we did it. And we don't have an answer to that at all.
Okay, we have 2 questions. I have lots of questions left, but we're coming to the end of our time. We're going to do 2 questions. The first is, what has China learned from Russia and Ukraine, and what has Taiwan learned?
Well, I think the Russians, sorry, the Chinese have been challenging the Taiwanese in various ways. They do these flights through the air defense zone of Taiwan on a daily basis now, running fighters and bombers and surveillance aircraft. They are being more and more hostile at sea, particularly in the Taiwan Straits, and they're practicing invasion. We watch these exercises on satellite, so we see them. Taiwanese see them. I think the Taiwanese are watching what the Europeans, NATO, plan to do to help Ukraine, and of course, the answer is not enough. It's kind of, how come, I mean, if I were Taiwanese, I would say, how come the US hasn't sent troops in or NATO hasn't sent forces in? Why are they sitting on the sidelines? Now, there's a lot of good reasons why they're sitting on the sidelines, but from a Taiwan point of view, there, but for the grace of God, go I. I mean, they're worried. Are they going to get help from America? Are they going to get help from Japan and Korea and other countries if they're attacked? That's the real worry in Taiwan. There's nothing particularly new militarily. What's new is political. And I think that's what's got the Taiwanese worried. They've been worried in the past by constant reports, think tanks, Rand Corporation, from the Pentagon and others saying, we can't really defend Taiwan, we're going to lose. China is much more powerful now than it was 10 years ago. So maybe we should think about something else to do. I mean, so I think the Taiwanese are very nervous, and rightfully so. There are a lot of things that can be done to ameliorate and mitigate the situation and help the Taiwanese. That's what we're talking about in our report next week. But I think that's the lesson, if you want. The West did not defend Taiwan. I mean, did not defend Ukraine. And does that mean they would not defend Taiwan? That's the big question.
So we're coming to the end, and listeners know that I like to end on a question, the answer to which is positive. I don't know if you have any of those. The question is, two people asked. One is first, what should the United States be doing regarding aid to Ukraine that it has not done so far? And the other person phrased it differently. He said, if you were the president of the United States, there's the possibility of a positive answer. If you were the president of the United States, what would you do? And how long do you think American civilians, who are very supportive of Ukraine right now, how long do you think American civilians will support the war if the result is more inflation and supply disruptions?
Two different things. As far as what the president can or can't do, it's not in the nature of more military supplies, because by the time they get there, the fight will be over. I think what the president can and should do is encourage the Ukrainians to go to, be serious and negotiate a solution. I think it's at that point now. If we're going to wait and see how this battle, whether the British right, they think it's going to last a long time and this battle is going to stalemate. I don't think so, but there's different views on that. But I think for one thing, the Ukrainians are running out of capabilities, and the more they run out, the more difficult it is for negotiation. So I'd hope that the president, because the president has basically encouraged the Ukrainians in the war not to get out of the war. And I think that's the wrong approach. Same with NATO. I think the time has come to say, look, we need to find a solution with Russia and with Ukraine that everybody can live with. Such a deal is possible. It's been possible all along, by the way. But it's more difficult now because there's so many dead, there's so much destruction, so many civilians lost, industry destroyed. I mean, it's a really, it's going to take trillions of dollars to restore Ukraine after this war, if it can be done. So I think the president would be better, and it would be more helpful if Washington would lead the peace campaign.
And I would point out that they said the same thing about the reconstruction of Syria, and nothing has been spent on the reconstruction of Syria. I'm afraid we might have, yes, typical, and I'm afraid that might also happen in Ukraine, that people will say, yes, we have to build Ukraine, we have to send the refugees back to something.
Could you remind me, the second part of your question was?
Oh, how long will Americans support the war?
I don't know.
Well, that's not exactly a positive answer on which to leave.
I think people are highly sympathetic to the plight of the Ukrainians, and they will remain so. It's a terrible thing to have inflicted on you, but that's the reality. Public opinion doesn't play much of a role on the battlefield, unless it's a long, sustained mess like Vietnam, where people get disgusted with it. But since we're not using our troops and our people aren't being killed, this is just sympathy with an underdog, quite legitimate. I don't see any reason for it to change a whole lot, but it doesn't make much difference either.
Okay, so again, it's not the most optimistic note upon which
it's my best,
but it's a little bit better, because it assumes that the American people will, side with what they perceive as the underdog and try to do the right things.
But the first part was very optimistic. If Washington will take a positive approach to solving the conflict rather than just encouraging more war, that would be good.
I'm gonna go with that for now. And I'm going to thank you, Stephen Bryen, for joining the Jewish Policy Center webinar today and updating us and enlightening us about what's going on in Ukraine. I don't think it's going anywhere in the near future. So this sort of thing is very important to us to understand what's happening, understand what the battlefield situation looks like. And I thank you especially for your maps, because I think maps help us to see the situation in a more realistic way. So thank you. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We will be back. Have a good day.